Hello everyone, my name is Taxauber and welcome back to the Lovecraftian Video Game Retrospective, and welcome back to The Darkness Within, this time to the second part, The Dark Lineage. This game is, as you all know, the sequel to the first Darkness Within, In Pursuit of Loth Nolda, and once more we take the role of Police Officer Lorette, but this time we solve a different mystery. It's not a murder case, but instead we pursue our own Dark Lineage, as mentioned in the title. This game is still an adventure game, but instead of being a game where you move in discrete steps from spot to spot, this game has free movement in the first-person perspective, which is nice, but also leads to a couple of issues I'm going to mention later. With regard to story, this game sort of is a sequel to the first one, but it's very loosely connected. A lot of characters from the first game are never mentioned again, such as Arthur, your friend and fellow police officer, and instead it almost feels like it's a completely new game, just featuring the same character. The game story isn't very satisfying. For the most part, and for a large part of the game, it feels like you are not really doing anything that's directly connected to the story. There are a couple of plots mentioned, you get some background information, but the actual game's plot could probably be boiled down to half an hour of gameplay, and in the meantime you read snippets, you get some background information, but a lot of that doesn't really lead anywhere, and there are also a couple of subplots that go completely unresolved. You essentially get some information, the game hints at there being more, but then you just never hear of those people ever again, and that's pretty much it. So with regard to story, I can't really recommend this game. It does have two endings, but the difference between them is very, very slim. And you can essentially just save just before the ending, watch one ending, and then reload and watch the other ending, and they essentially just, for the most part, lead to the same thing, so it's not really worth playing the game twice for that. And with regard to gameplay, this game is still an adventure game. You collect items, you combine items, you read documents, you underline information in the documents, you find clues, you combine them in the same item and thought combining menu from the first game. It works well for the most part from a pure mechanical point of view, but the issue is more that a lot of the puzzles are very convoluted and can take a long time to solve. There are also a couple of mechanical puzzles that allow you to mess up really easily, but they don't really allow you to reset the puzzle really easily, which can be a little bit frustrating. And there are also a couple of puzzles where it isn't really clear when you have failed and have to restart over, which in my opinion is a cardinal sin for adventure games. Overall, this game also suffers from the fact that a lot of the puzzles you solve aren't really connected to the story, so you have the feeling that you spend half an hour trying to solve a puzzle, and then you solve it, and then you just get one key to open a door, and you don't really have the feeling you just achieved something. The graphics in this game they look decent, but in my opinion they are a step down from the first Darkness Within. Because first Darkness Within had handcrafted graphics that they weren't the most realistic looking or the best looking graphics, but they look quite unique, and you had the feeling that every location had its own character. This game here, being first person not free roaming, but free movement game, means that the graphics took a little bit of a step down. And while they don't look terrible, there are a couple of assets that are just used over and over and over again. And the game also seems to suffer from a lack of anti-aliasing, at least that's how it looked like to me, even though I cranked up anti-aliasing to the maximum and my computer can easily handle everything this game demands. The game also has a couple of technical issues. I wasn't able to run it in proper full screen. Other people apparently had issues running the game at all with their graphics card or were unable to install it properly, and some of these issues were fixed with the game's director's cut, but some of them seem to be unresolved, and I also had to manually edit the configuration file to make this game run in proper widescreen resolution, even though this game came out in 2010, so it's not that old. And for the most part it seems to have a lot more technical issues than the first Darkness Within, which is a little bit odd. So before you buy this game, be aware that it might not run optimally, if at all, on your machine. With regard to puzzle design, the game, as I already mentioned, some of the puzzles are really convoluted, and the problem is also that some puzzles have very illogical sequences. For example, there's one puzzle where you have to get a key from a drawer under a table, And before you can get the key, you have to examine the table. But before you can examine the table, you have to click on a hotspot. Now the problem is that this hotspot is a couple of footsteps on the ground, and there are actually two hotspots for those footsteps. They are right next to one another, and it's not obvious that there are two different hotspots. Now what the game should do is just allow you to click on the table hotspot, but it doesn't do that. Instead you have to click on one of the footprint hotspots and not on the other. You can click on the other, but it doesn't have any effect. So if you only click on one and are unaware that there even is a second hotspot because they're right next to one another, then you can't progress, and you really should be able to progress. Now this is only one puzzle and it's not a complete game breaker, but it does happen a couple of times, and quite frankly it does happen too often in the game. And these are just sequences that shouldn't even be sequences. You should just be able to do all this stuff in any order you want. And if the game really wants you to check out those footprints, then just have my character mention them while I pass them or while I examine the table. And this is unfortunately something that happens way too often in this game. What is really good in Darkness Within 2 are the music and the sounds. The sounds sound very good, in my opinion, and the music is very moody, very atmospheric. But unfortunately the game still isn't very scary. For the most part there's no feeling of dread whatsoever. You find a couple of corpses, there are a couple of dark places, but nothing looks really all that bad. The first Darkness Within had those nightmare sequences, which in my opinion added a lot to the atmosphere, but unfortunately the second game doesn't quite seem to be able to capture that. With regard to Lovecraftian elements, there are more in this game than there were in the first game. Some of them are truly Lovecraftian, but some of them are also more references. For example, the one town you find in the game is called Arkham, which obviously is a reference to Lovecraft's Arkham. And one thing I have to mention with regard to story, sort of, is that everything in this game looks like it's from the 1920s, if not the 1890s. Even though this game takes place after the Darkness Within 1, in 2011, which, when the game was released, was actually in the future. But for some reason, Lloyd had a computer, a television and a mobile phone in the first game, but all of this is gone. His mobile phone is gone, and the town of Arkham, where you spend a good part of your time, is, according to the innkeeper, a place where the people still like to live like their ancestors hundreds of years ago. So it's essentially a town that runs on steam, doesn't really have any proper electricity, and has houses that look like they were built 140 years ago. And it doesn't really tie into the story at all. This could just be a modern village. There's no reason for it to be that old. It could be isolated and maybe a little bit old-fashioned or conservative, but there's no reason for this to look like the 1920s. It feels really forced and it feels completely out of place. And my final verdict is that I can't really recommend this game. If you are a Lovecraft fan, you're probably going to be frustrated by all those puzzles and by the lack of actual Lovecraftian elements, or by the lack of a satisfying story. And if you really like the first Darkness Within, then maybe give it a shot, but be aware that in my opinion it is a step down from the first game in many regards. And the first game wasn't exactly the best game. It's not terrible, just like this game is not terrible, but I just can't give it a high recommendation. One last note are the different versions of this game. There's a basic version, which was originally published. There is the collector's edition, which comes with the first Darkness Within. That also comes with a soundtrack. And there's a director's cut, which I think is only available for digital download, but I'm not quite sure about that. The director's cut adds some more graphical options, which improve the game somewhat, but not to a significant degree, and also changes some of the elements of the game, but overall it's not a significant change. And while the director's cut does fix some technical issues, it also introduces new technical issues. So yeah, be aware of that when you purchase this game. So thanks for watching, and I shall see you next time. Take care and goodbye.